Welcome to the lecture on Chapter 7, Rebirth, the Age of the Renaissance. And in the background, you should hear some Renaissance music to kind of set the tone. In this chapter on the Renaissance, we'll be leaving behind the discussion of religion exclusively through and beyond the Middle Ages and moving into that study of the Renaissance period. The previous few chapters had us pausing to look at religion and Christendom and that religion through the Middle Ages and that movement into the Renaissance period. We had to establish the importance of religion to humanity and how this focus brought about wars, crusades, pilgrimages, and martyrs. It brought about that need for churches, bigger and bigger churches, which impacted the future of architecture. It also impacted literature and art. So we start to see, these focus on religion that started in the previous period and is going to travel a little into this period. But architecture and literature and art are all going to be impacted by changes. The Middle Ages, that middle period that we talked about, that helped pave the way for future religion. Now we turn to the timeline, return to our timeline, and we move forward into even bigger changes. So first we need to start off talking about this concept of the Renaissance. Renaissance actually means rebirth, this idea of being reborn. And so many great innovations and art forms are developed during this time. Concepts are reborn. Ideas are reborn. So the Renaissance is the turning point between the medieval times and modern times. It begins in Italy and spreads through the rest of Europe. It was a time of new thought and advancement. There are new ways of thinking that developed in the areas of architecture, science, philosophy, politics, and it was a period of great intellectual and artistic creativity. So much of what we base modern thought and creativity on today was established during this Renaissance period. The 14th century was a period of transition. They're transitioning from that medieval time to the Renaissance time. And this period of transition is marked by a number of dramatic developments. One of those was the struggle for survival against the bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death. Another struggle were the trials of long and debilitating war that was happening between England and France. It went on for 100 years. It's called the 100-Year War. A third dramatic development was the decline of the Roman Catholic Church, and we call this the Great Schism. Let's start with the Black Death, or the bubonic plague. It struck in 1347, and in less than a century, it destroyed a third to a half of the population. That's a major destruction. It originated in China. Sound familiar? It was carried to Europe by flea-bearing black rats infesting the commercial vessels that brought goods to the Mediterranean ports. And the body would literally turn black if someone was infected with the plague or the Black Death. That's where we get the name the Black Death. And of course there were different phases to the illness, but eventually that body was going to turn black. The plague hit hardest in towns that were densely populated. It just kind of hastened the spread, and there was a lack of sanitation in those densely populated areas. So this also made the disease more difficult to contain. There were actually 4 waves of the plague that spread through Europe. There was widespread death, especially among the poor, and this caused a shortage of labor, because remember, the poor folks were the ones that were out there doing those various tasks of labor and those sorts of jobs. So this creates a great demand for workers. There's a shortage of laborers now. So this is a good opportunity for workers that are healthy and able to work. Others fled the rural manors for cities where the jobs were more readily available. And so this exodus from the countryside spurred an urban growth and contributed to that slow disintegration of that mannerism concept, working on the manners for a lord. In 1358, French peasants, the Jacques, stage an angry protest. In England, in 1381, there was the Peasants' Revolt of 1831, which hastened the demise of feudalism. So mannerism and feudalism and that feudal order are going by the wayside. All of these revolts left their imprint on the social history of the West. So things are changing when it comes to the social history. So the lower class is taking a major step toward equality now during this period with the rest of society. England's laborers were not the first to contest the monarchy, however. The Magna Carta, known as the Great Charter, was the first one to do that. The barons had forced King John to sign this document that basically forbid the king to levy additional feudal taxes without the consent of his royal council. So he couldn't go rogue and just add more taxes and more taxes. He had to have the consent of the royal council. This constitutional landmark asserted primacy of the law over the will of the ruler. And so this is going to be huge to civilization. This idea that, you know, a ruler couldn't just do whatever he wanted. He had to follow the law. And so this is a big constitutional landmark. By the end of the century, the English had laid the groundwork for a constitutional monarchy that would bridge the gap between that medieval feudalism and more of a modern democracy. So you're starting to see that representative type government and a change in those ideals about how things should be run. The 100 Years' War that we mentioned before was France versus England. And this war was basically, it literally lasted 100 years, and it was fought entirely on French soil. It was the result of a long-standing English claim to continental lands, and the English won most of the early battles due to their use of foot soldiers, and they had the long bow, and they had this invisible enemy, gunpowder. And gunpowder is a landmark advance in military technology. Gunpowder comes on the scene, and as we've said before, it is a game changer. It's a landmark in military technology. Joan of Arc becomes this charismatic leader. She was a 17-year-old female who begged the King of France to allow her to obey the voices of the Christian saints who directed her to expel the English. So she puts on armor, she's riding a white horse, and she leads the French into battle. Her success forced the English to withdraw from Orleans, but initiated her martyrdom. She ends up getting betrayed by her supporters, and in 1431 she's condemned a heretic and burned at the stake. So the 100-Year War deals a major blow again to feudalism. After the English withdrew from France, both countries began to move in separate directions, ultimately becoming independent nation-states. Now, there are two events that proved the most damaging to the prestige of the Catholic Church. We mentioned in an earlier slide that, you know, there is going to be big changes in the Catholic Church. Now, the first one of these events is the Avignon Papacy, okay? In the Avignon Papacy, there's the relocation of the papacy from Rome to the city of Avignon in southern France in response to political pressure from the French king. So the Avignon popes establish a very luxurious and powerful court using tough and sometimes corrupt means to accomplish their purpose. There's an increasing need for the church revenue, which leads some of these popes, these Avignon popes, to sell church offices and to levy and sell pardons for sins. So you want to be forgiven, you want a pardon for your sin, pay up. All right. You want to hold an office in the church, pay up. So there's a lot of corruption going on in this Avignon papacy. The papacy eventually is returned to Rome in 1377, and soon there is the second most damaging event, the Great Schism, that occurs. This leads to a rift between France and Italy, and so because of that, instead of just having one pope, they will have two popes elected, one representing France, one representing Italy. So this great schism causes separation of the Roman Empire into two empires. The reason for that division of the church was that the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Patriarch of Rome decided to excommunicate one another. So, okay, so you're in charge and I'm in charge, but I have the power to excommunicate you. Well, you excommunicated me, I'm going to excommunicate you. So the Great Schism came as a result of that Avignon papacy. Both of those events added to the decline of the church. All right, so then we have the arts in the Renaissance. There's a revival of the Greco-Roman culture that spreads from the birthplace in Florence, Italy, to all parts of the European West. There are clear signs of revised self-consciousness, a growing preoccupation with gender and with class, and spirited efforts to represent the world with greater objectivity. So there is this revival of that Greek/Roman culture, what we call the Greco-Roman culture. All right, so the arts are in transition. In literature and art, there's a new fidelity to nature and to personal experience in the everyday world. So you're going to see in the literature of the time, the art of the time, you're going to see this focus on nature and this personal experience in the everyday world. You see close, objective attention to human society and to social interaction. And we call this social realism. Okay, so again, you'll see that in the literature and the art of the period, that social realism. We previously mentioned Boccaccio when we were studying medieval times, but his work continues in the Renaissance and is recognized as being impactful to Renaissance art and technique. So let's talk about Boccaccio's famous work, the Decameron. This was a framework story. And a framework story sets up a frame for the story. Okay? For example, in his, it is set in the time of the plague. All right? Eager to escape contagion, there are 7 young women and 3 young men who retreat to a villa in the suburbs of Florence, where to pass the time, each of them is going to tell a story on each of the 10 days that they are there. So basically, they're quarantined, okay? They're trying to stay away from the plague. And so since there are these 10 people, you've got 10 days. So each of them is going to tell a story on each of those 10 days. So that's the frame of the story. And then within that frame, you're going to have the stories themselves, okay? The stories will be distractions from the horrors of a pandemic. They will be amusing. They will be secular and not religious. They will provide insight into the social concerns and the values of both the fictional narrators and Boccaccio's reading public. Many of the stories are borrowed from popular fables or fabliaux, which are humorous narrative tales and contemporary incidents. The characters are very high-spirited, they're clever, they're good humor, which would appeal to those going through the unstable and rapidly changing times. So not only is this the story of the characters in the story, but this is also framed with the story about the plague and about these 10 people that are taking refuge and quarantining to escape the plague. Okay, so that's what we call a frame story. Now, this story is going to be very important because when we talk more about Chaucer, you're going to see how this writing of Boccaccio gave him the idea for his story. Another person we need to talk about in this, time period is Christine de Pizan. She is the first feminist writer, and she emerged in France. When her husband died, she returned to writing because she had to support 3 children. So she becomes the first female professional writer. She was attacked, of course. She attacked along anti-female tradition in which women were demeaned and they were denied the right to a university or education. So her feminism occurred at a time in which men were making all the systemic efforts to restrict female inheritance of land and restrict female membership in guilds like writers' guilds or anything else. So she actually becomes a spokesperson for female achievements through her efforts. And one of her famous writings was Book of the City of Ladies, and it was an attack on misogyny, male dominance, and it was a defense of the female right to education. Another famous author that we've mentioned is Chaucer, Geoffrey Chaucer. He is one of the greatest masters of the 14th century vernacular literature, which vernacular is just the language or the dialect that's spoken by the ordinary people in a particular county or region. So his work is written in everyday language of the times. Middle English was the everyday language of the time. Chaucer shaped the development of English literature as much as Dante had a century earlier when he influenced the course of Italian poetry. Canterbury Tales, one of the most famous works by Geoffrey Chaucer, was modeled very broadly on Boccaccio's Decameron, but it was framed by Chaucer in the setting of a pilgrimage during medieval times. Okay, so that's why we mentioned him in medieval times, and we pick him up again here. He sets his story in the frame of a pilgrimage during medieval times, whose participants tell stories to entertain one another and to pass the time. They're traveling to the shrine of St. Thomas of Becket in Canterbury. There are 29 pilgrims that include a miller, a monk, a plowman, a knight, a priest, a scholar, a prioress, who is the head of a household of nuns. And this provides a literary cross-section of all of medieval society. It's not just focusing on characters that would have been part of the upper class or all of the lower class. It's a sampling of, all of that medieval society. The stories range from moral tales and beast fables to fabliaux of the most risque and bawdy sort. Now, Chaucer takes on this. If he's got 29 pilgrims and they are supposed to each tell, I believe, 2 stories on the way and way back, eventually he was going to be telling, I think, a total of 144 tales. Needless to say, he did not get through all of them. Okay, this was a great undertaking of his. Again, this is a frame story. The frame is the pilgrims on their way to a pilgrimage, and within that frame, you have all of these individual stories that are told. Chaucer, like his medieval predecessors, he tended to moralize and reserve special scorn for people of religion, the clerics that would abuse that privilege, and human hypocrisy. So he brought his characters to life by means of memorable details, and he didn't just give them stereotypical actions. And a lot of times his stories in this do kind of poke fun at the church and poke fun at people that make you pay for pardons and things such as that. Another famous artist of this time is Giotto, all right? Now, Giotto, something he's known for is the concept of new realism. He's got the chiaroscuro, which is a painting technique where you've got gradations of light and shade. Three-dimensional presence is not, he brings into his artwork, has not been seen since Roman times. So again, here's this rebirth, this renewal, if you will, of some of these early Roman painting concepts. His art represents a landmark in a new era because it introduced a natural and lifelike style that anticipated the Italian Renaissance picture making. Giotto broke with the decorative formality of the Byzantine painting, which had strongly influenced the style of the late medieval altarpiece. So we have this famous piece that we've looked at before, this one where, remember Jesus, this is, after the crucifixion. You see, instead of him being in the center of the painting, he's off to the left, which draws the eye there. But you do see those gradations of color. You go from light, right, to shade in areas. There's a very three-dimensional presence about this, almost like you could step into this painting. You've got weighty, robust figures. So a lot of the new realism of Giotto involved introducing those natural and lifelike styles. In music, we've got the Ars Nova, which is new art. The music of Ars Nova features increased rhythmic complexity and aural expressiveness that's achieved in part by what we call isorhythm, or the same rhythm, which is the close repetition of identical rhythmic patterns in different portions of a composition. Isorhythm reflected a new interest in manipulating the pitches and the rhythms, and it gave unprecedented unity to musical compositions. At the same time, there were unexpected variations in rhythmic patterns that could be achieved by way of a new musical effect known as syncopation, which shifted the accent from the normally strong beat to the weaker beat. Then we have a famous French poet, priest, and composer named Guillaume de Mauchamp. He was a proponent of Ars Nova, that new art. His most important musical achievement was his Messe de Notre Dame, the Mass of Our Lady. And instead of the medieval practice of treating the Mass as 5 separate compositions based on Gregorian chant, he unified the textually fixed portions of the Mass into a single polyphonic composition and added a 6th movement known as the Mass is ended, that would dismiss the whole congregation. So in addition to his sacred works, he had a number of secular works as well, which included 142 polyphonic ballads. These look back at the music of the troubadour, but their attention to expressive details unique. And he introduced new warmth and lyricism as well as vivid poetic imagery. All right, so Renaissance Italy. In Renaissance Italy, there's a new realism in the arts. There's increasing secularism, which is that, non-church kind of existence, and the spirit of criticism that accompanied the decline of the church. All of these were features of that transitional 14th century. These became a real focus in the cities of the Italian peninsula. So we've got cities like Venice and Genoa that had profited financially from the Crusades, and despite the ravages of the plague, they continued to enjoy a high level of commercial prosperity. Florence is one of those cities in particular that was dominated by its landmark cathedral. And this is where the Renaissance would really flower. Florence was the prime center of trade, and it becomes this center of what we call humanism. So here you can see on the map, Florence is right up in this region. So it's this becomes the hub. This becomes the prime center of trade, as we mentioned, but it also becomes this place where so much of secular art and prosperity come into play. In Italy, this movement to recover the culture of classical antiquity, right, that looking at the classics from Greek and Rome and what was left, that movement to recover the culture of that classical antiquity would become the dominant feature of the Renaissance. There's a certain family, the Medici family. They were a wealthy banking family in Florence. They rose to power during the 14th century. Commercial ingenuity of the Medici enhanced the material status of Florentine citizens, and partly because strong, uninterrupted leadership guaranteed local economic stability. And they ruled Florence for 4 generations. They supported scholarship and they were big patrons of the arts. They commissioned works from such artists as Brunelleschi, Botticelli, Verrocchio, and Michelangelo. And these produced some of the West's most brilliant art. So we have from this one family, the Medici family, we have this wonderful support of the arts and scholarship that's going to lead to some of the most wonderful artworks still in the world today. Renaissance humanism, an approach to learning. So classical humanism, that revival of the Greco-Roman culture, was a major feature of the Italian Renaissance, and it's a phenomenon that gives the period its distinctly secular stamp. The classical revival of the 14th through the 16th centuries, that age of the Renaissance, generated new and more all-embracing attitudes toward Greco-Roman antiquity than any that had preceded it. Renaissance humanists discovered on the Greek and Latin classical a rational guide to the fulfillment of human potential. Renaissance revival of humanism differed from earlier revivals because it attracted the interest of a broad base of the population and not just a mere handful of theologians, as we saw in the Carolinian or later medieval times. Renaissance humanists were the archaeologists of their age. They uncovered new evidence of the splendor of the Greco-Roman antiquity and consumed the fruits of that Western heritage. They saw no conflict between humanism and religious belief. They viewed their intellectual mission as both pleasing to God and advantageous to society. Humanism was grounded in a reevaluation of classical literature and art, and it represented a shift in emphasis rather than an entirely new pursuit. Now we've got three people in particular that were definitely part of this humanism during the Renaissance, and we'll talk about each one individually. There was Petrarch, Ficini, and Pico della Mirandola. Let's start with Petrarch. Petrarch was known as the father of humanism. He was a poet and a scholar. He devoted his life to the recovery, the recopying, and the editing of Latin manuscripts. In fact, he wrote hundreds of letters describing his admiration for antiquity and his enthusiasm for the classics. His favorite poetic form was the sonnet, the 14-line lyric poem. It was Petrarch who brought it to perfection, and we call this the Petrarch sonnet. He also revived the epistolary tradition, and he's deeply influenced by Cicero and Augustine. He also is recognized for the Canzoniere songbook, which is where he did perfect that sonnet form. Another key figure in Renaissance humanism is Ficini. He was a humanist and a philosopher. Greek manuscripts and Byzantine scholars poured into Italy, and Ficini called it a golden age. He translated the entire corpus of Plato's writings from Greek into Latin, which of course made them available to Western scholars for the first time since antiquity, because they could actually read the writings of Plato. He founded the Platonic Academy in Florence, which launched a reprisal of Plato and the Neoplatists that had major consequences in the domains of art and literature. We get the term, he coins the term Platonic, also known as spiritual love, and said that this platonic or spiritual love attracts the soul to good or to God. This idea was advanced and popularized by Ficini. Platonic love became a major theme among Renaissance poets and painters who held that spiritual love was inspired by physical beauty. So that idea of platonic love, right, through the ideas of Plato, right, ends up being something that we attribute to Ficino. Another important figure of humanism in the Renaissance is Pico della Mirandola. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola undertook the translation of various ancient literary works in Hebrew, Arabic, Latin, Greek. He was a humanist, a poet, a theologian. He sought not only to bring to light the entire history of human thought, but he also wanted to prove that all intellectual expression shared the same divine purpose and design, which he called the unity of truth. And this is just that philosophical thought that dominated the arts and ideas of the Renaissance. He typified the activist spirit of Renaissance individualism, the affirmation of the unique, self-fashioning potential of the human being. In his oration on the dignity of man, basically he writes this manifesto of humanism. He described humanity's position on the chain of being that linked the divine and the and the earth to the other realms. So you've got this, humans have a position as only being a little lower than angels on the chain of being. He sought not only to bring to light the entire history of the human thought, but to prove that all intellectual expression shared the same divine purpose and design. All right, so another important person to Renaissance humanism is Castiglione, and he was known for this concept of the well-rounded person, and that is something we're definitely going to see in the Renaissance, is this idea of the real well-rounded person. He was an Italian diplomat and humanist. He wrote the Book of the Courtier, which is a treatise inspired by a series of conversations that had taken place among a group of 16th century aristocrats. The subject of the book concerned the qualifications of being the ideal Renaissance man and woman. You've got the Book of the Courtier being an index to the cultural changes that were taking place between medieval and early modern times. It basically told individuals how they should act and how their actions may impress their peers instead of the intrinsic moral value of those actions. For example, there's the idea of that l'uomo universal, the well-rounded person. Men must influence those who rule, and women must entertain the men of the courts, right? So anyway, this focuses on manners and not morals. An important part of this humanism in the Renaissance is the creation of the printing press. Now, Johann Gutenberg perfected this movable type printing press in 1450. The Gutenberg Bible was actually printed in 1455. And the Gutenberg Bible or the printing press is going to revolutionize learning and communication. There's the ability now for information to be produced for mass consumption, right? It's a lot faster to print a book with movable type than it was to recopy a book, right? So books are made more readily available to the public. And this is going to facilitate the rise of popular education. More people will be able to read and have access to reading materials. Nicole Machiavelli is another very important figure during this Renaissance time period. He was a keen political observer and a student of Roman history. He lamented Italy's unity in the face of the continuous rivalry between the city-states, and he anticipated that outside powers might try to take advantage of Italy's internal weaknesses. So he writes the book The Prince, which is a political treatise that called for the unification of Italy under a powerful and courageous leader. He laid out the guidelines for how an aspiring ruler might gain and maintain political power. He argued that the need for a strong state justified strong rule. The word Machiavellian soon became synonymous with that idea of political duplicity. Renaissance art. Now, the Italian Renaissance art is usually divided into two periods. There is the early Renaissance from 1400 to 1490, and then there is the high Renaissance period from 1490 to 1520. Now, that early Renaissance, that's a time of experimentation with new techniques of representation. Productivity was centered in Florence. And then the later high Renaissance, the techniques of representation reached new levels of refinement. Both patronage and productivity shifted from Rome to Milan. Renaissance art was a tangible expression of the increasing wealth that was seen in that later high Renaissance. Those who supported the arts did so in part to leave their mark upon society. So by supporting the arts, by buying artwork, by having artwork commissioned, they were making their mark upon society. Or another reason people supported the arts was to immortalize themselves for posterity. Thus, art becomes evidence of material well-being as well as a visible extension of the ego in an age of individualism. So you're going to see a lot of portraits, okay, depictions of someone that has been, the artist was commissioned to do this portrait of someone, and now they've been immortalized for prosperity because they have this painting of themselves. So, in that early Renaissance, we have a time of experimentation with new techniques of representation and productivity. These techniques of representation reach new levels of refinement during that later high Renaissance. Those who supported the arts, again, did so to leave their mark on posterity. Active patronage enhanced the social and financial status of the Renaissance artist. So for the first time in Western history, artists came to wield influence as humanists, scientists, and poets. A new phenomenon of the artist as a hero and a genius was born. Giorgio Vasari is an Italian painter, architect, and critic, and he immortalized hundreds of Renaissance artists in his monumental biography, The Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Artists, Architects, and Sculptors. So to be in that book and recognized, and him painting that picture of artists as heroes and geniuses really helped, to increase art. This brings us to architecture. Now, early Renaissance architects were devoted to the principles laid out by the Roman architect and engineer Vitruvius, which had said that a building's function would determine the design. And early Renaissance architecture is characterized by that approach that is rational and intellectual rather than emotional and dramatic. Now, this is a famous church that we are going to talk about a lot during this lecture. The architects were Filippo Brunelleschi and Michelozzo di Bartolomeo. So, when we talk about this early Renaissance architecture, Again, it's devoted to those architectural principles that were laid out by Vitruvius Pollio. He was a Roman architect, and in his treatise on architecture, which was called De Architectura, he asserted that there were three principles of good architecture. One was called firmatus, which means durability. The building should stand up robustly and remain in good condition. Another principle of good architecture was utilitas, which is utility. It should be useful and function well for the people using it. And the final principle of good architecture is venustatis, which is beauty. It should delight people and raise their spirits. So durability, utility, and beauty were three of the important principles of good architecture. Among his principles was that classical notion that human proportions mirrored the universal order. Rational architecture, reflecting natural laws, according to Renaissance theorists, would cultivate rational individuals. So, rational architecture, reflecting natural laws, would cultivate rational individuals, and harmoniously proportioned buildings would produce ideal citizens. So we have a famous architect, sculptor, and theorist, Filippo Brunelleschi. He's the one that designed that beautiful dome of the Florence Cathedral. He has a younger colleague, Leon Battista Alberti, that hailed the completed dome as, quote, a feat of engineering, unknown as unimaginable among the ancients. So you've got Brunelleschi, who's going to defend those classical principles of symmetry and proportion in architectural design. And he's designed the dome of the Florence Cathedral, which is still one of the most recognized domes in architectural history. Now, Alberti, his little colleague, his young colleague, is going to share his enthusiasm for harmonious proportions, and he actually writes a book, The 10 Books on Architecture. So here we have the Duomo of Florence, Italy, also known as Florence Cathedral Dome, okay? You see that Brunelleschi, the architect, constructed this in 1420 to 1436. The dome is the largest dome since that of the Pantheon in Rome. Now, it consists of two octagonal shells, each incorporating 8 curved panels joined by massive ribs that soar upward from the octagonal drum, the section immediately beneath that dome, to converge at an elegant lantern through which light enters the interior. Brunelleschi's dome became a legend in its time, and it still remains an architectural landmark and is kind of the defining feature of that Florentine skyline. So you see that dome here. This is the Cathedral Church of Florence before the dome. And in fact, you see that they've got everything built ready for that dome to be placed on top. There's a wonderful video out there on the how an amateur built the world's biggest dome, a National Geographic video link that is so worth watching, and I will post that in Blackboard as well. Here's another look at the dome for the Florence Cathedral. There is an inner dome and an outer dome. In the space between those two shells, he designed an interlocking system of ribs that operate like a hidden flying buttress. At the base of the dome, it's reinforced by stone chains. He constructed a double wall made of sandstone bricks laid in a herringbone fashion. And to raise this dome, because we saw the building in the previous slide, the dome had to be raised up on top and lowered. He devised new methods of hoisting stone and ingenious masonry techniques, all of which won him acclaim in Florence during his time. His younger colleague, again, called this a feat of engineering. And this dome has definitely become a legend of its time. So you see the drawing of the outer dome and the inner dome. Here you see the interior of the completed dome, and you see inside that dome frescoes of the Last Judgment. All right. Now, you see all these beautiful paintings going all the way up. You've got this lovely depictions of the Last Judgment. Now, for those of you that are video gamers, you may have played Assassin's Creed, and there was one of those games for Assassin's Creed that actually had the character climbing the dome. You've got some, in that game itself, you have some great 3D architecture and panoramic views of the Renaissance Florence too. So it's worth taking a look at that video link as well. All right. Now, Filippo Brunelleschi also did some other structures. The dome, the Florence Cathedral was not his only structure. Now, you've got the Pazzi Chapel, which is a cloister of Santa Croce in Florence. You've got a gray stone moldings and gray Corinthian pilasters, those shallow, flattened, rectangular columns that adhere to the wall surface. These pilasters emphasize the interior, and they produce a sense of order and harmony that's unsurpassed in early Renaissance architecture. There are geometric designs that dominate this intimate chapel. Every part of it which is immediately accessible to the eye. The effect of the rationalized space is emphasized by the cool tones of gray and white. In medieval cathedrals, remember, the eye is coaxed upward, heavenward, whereas with this Pazzi Chapel, it fixes the beholder on the earth. You know, it brings your eye down toward the earth. This was produced for the Pazzi family of Florence in the cloister of the Franciscan Basilica of Santa Croce. He placed a dome over the central square with two short barrel vaults, and the interior is where Brunelleschi breaks with the medieval past. So we see a lot of these, you know, the use of the gray and white, the design. We see him breaking with some of the medieval architecture of the past. Here's an outside view of this same building and some of the inside. Beautiful structure. Brunelleschi's enthusiasm for an architecture of harmonious proportions was shared by the multi-talented Florentine humanist Leon Battista Alberto, which again was a young protege of Brunelleschi. Alberti argued that architectural design should proceed from the square and circle. He thought those were the two most perfect geometric shapes, which could be employed in the traditional three we can see in this palazzo design. But he also adhered to the classical principles of balance, which is we see in a townhouse design for the wealthy Russelli family of Florence. The stories of this building are of equal height. You see the Russelli coat of arms over some of the windows on the second level. You can see the coat of arms. You also see the rows of crisply defined arcaded windows that appear on that upper story, okay? You also see square windows placed well above the street for safety and privacy on that first level, and they accent that. And from the Colosseum, Alberti borrowed the device of alternating arches and engaged columns, and flattening the latter into pilasters. All right, they give here the principles of clarity and proportion still prevail. So you can see, you know, kind of some, you see on this side of the building the arches and the pillars, again borrowed from the Colosseum. It kind of gives that same kind of look. So this is that, and look at the cornice and all the decorative things. Also, each one of these stories We go from the biggest and kind of most textured brick on the first level to a little more refined, and then to a very smooth surface on this one. So some interesting architectural elements that are brought into the design of this building. The next thing that we want to discuss will be the early Renaissance painting, and that will take you into Lecture 2. Lecture 2 is going to be devoted predominantly to the early Renaissance painting. So that concludes this first lecture on the Renaissance, and I look forward to joining back up with you for Lecture 2. Thank you for joining me.